So, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining in today evening. It's a Friday evening, so really value your time. I'm Ashish. I'm the MD and CEO for the private wealth business at Motilal Oswal, and it's really my pleasure to host the Vantage Masterclass today. As you know, in our Vantage Masterclass series, we host promoters, authors, and many eminent personalities. And the idea is to, through our conversations, to bring real insights to you. So, in that regard, today I think I have an extra special guest. I have with me William Green, the author of the book Richer, Wiser, Happier. William has had a very illustrious career. He's written many publications, including the New Yorker, Fortune, Forbes, Bloomberg Markets, The Economist, and the Time magazine. In fact, during his stint in Hong Kong, he edited the Asian edition of the Time magazine, where he won several awards and accolades. Post Hong Kong, he moved to London, where he went to edit the European and Middle Eastern as well as African editions. Now, over the last quarter of a century, he's interviewed many eminent investors, personalities. In fact, it's enviable the kind of people he's met, and some of them have really shaped our thoughts as investors over the last few decades. More importantly, this is something that I didn't know. He interviewed our Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, when he became the Prime Minister in 2004. And he's also interviewed many CEOs. So really, I may say that he's a powerhouse of insights and experiences that he's collected along the way. He's also collaborated on various books. One of the most famous books was with Guy Spear, The Education of a Value Investor, right? And he was born and raised in London, educated at Eton, studied English literature at Oxford, and then a master's from Columbia University. Has dabbled, in gambling investments as well early on in his career, but and so it's been a very dynamic, illustrious career and journey so far. So welcome, William. Welcome to our Vantage Masterclass webinar, and thank you very much for being with us here today.
Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here with you. I always sound much more impressive when people summarize my life like that than I actually am. So now I have a lot to live up to. And you can see it's Friday morning here in New York where I am, and the sun has just come out and is beating down directly on my face. So I'll be moving around. So I like the fact that it's Friday evening where you are. So it's lovely to be shaking hands with you all across the world.
Yeah, no, it's looking good from here. I mean, looks like a bright sunny morning, and to kick it off, I just want you to talk us through a little bit about your journey and how you came about to write this book, and if you could also give us a little insight and peek into maybe some of the parts which are not in the book. Maybe there are some experiences that you've had while meeting all these great guys, and some of them you could not share in the book, but we are all ears. We have our clients, some institutional investors, and they're all very eager to listen to you today.
Oh, great, and I hope you'll have questions for me later as well. Thank you so much, Ashish. So I, as I explained at the start of this book, Richer, Wiser, Happier, I've been obsessed with investing really for a little more than a quarter of a century, but I can't emphasize just how unlikely an obsession this was. I never took a business class at school. I studied English literature at Oxford. I thought I was going to become a great novelist. I had these fantasies that I would become, the Charles Dickens of our time. And actually, I'm close friends with Aravind Adiga, who I hired at Time magazine, and he's fulfilled my ambition to become a great novelist. And also, I'm friends with Ramin Barani, who recently made the White Tiger movie for Netflix. So I thought I was going to become more like them, and instead, I surprised myself when I basically I came into a little bit of money when I was in my early 20s, where my brother and I had owned an apartment in London, and we sold it long before the run up in the London property market. And so suddenly I had this windfall. It wasn't a huge amount, but I had to decide, what am I going to do with it? And so I started to read obsessively about mutual funds and the stock market. And this really reawakened in me this fascination that I'd had with gambling on horses when I was about 15. And I had been at Eton as a teenager, and I was surrounded by all of these very posh English kids. I was supposed to be becoming an English gentleman like Boris Johnson, our current prime minister, or David Cameron, the previous prime minister, or Prince William or Prince Harry. And instead, I would sneak off on summer afternoons and would be gambling on horses. And there was what was euphemistically known as a turf accountant in Windsor, right near Windsor Castle, where the Queen lived, where I would go gamble on horses. And I had this illegal account under the name Mike Smith, which is not a very imaginative fake name. And it wasn't because I was in love with horses or I thought, that I had any advantage in playing this game. I really had this fantasy that there were certain ways in life where you could make money easily, just with money. You didn't have to work very hard. I was a pretty lazy guy. I didn't want to be working in a store or carrying things or working in an office and reporting to someone I didn't like. And so I think that was the earliest fantasy about gambling and then about investing. But then I had this tremendous advantage when it came to the stock market, which was that because I was a journalist, I could write for magazines like Forbes and Fortune and Money and Time, and I could actually go interview the greatest investors. So at the start, I was going to interview them, and I was thinking, well, this is great. I'm going to learn to get rich because these guys have cracked the code. They've figured it out. And so I would go off to, say, the Bahamas, and I would spend a day with someone like Sir John Tempelton, who's probably the greatest international stock picker of the 20th century. And I would be grilling him for all these ideas about how do you invest, and are we in a bubble at the moment, and what should I do? And then I would go off to interview, say, Fayez Sarafim, who is a very enigmatic Egyptian billionaire living in Houston, Texas. And he literally had an El Greco painting on one wall. He had a 5th century Syrian mosaic tile floor that he'd imported from a Syrian church and installed in the lobby of his office building in Texas. And he's sitting there smoking these enormous Cuban cigars. And it was a very exotic life. I was suddenly thrust into this world of these fascinating characters. And the more time I spent with them, the more I started to think, actually, there's something going on here that's really fascinating. These guys, and I'm embarrassed to say they are mostly guys. It's a very male-dominated industry, I'm afraid, still. That these guys, they weren't just masters of making money. They were extraordinary thinkers. And that was a revelation to me. I started to think, maybe I can actually learn not just to get rich, but I can actually learn how to think better. And then I started to think more when I was in my 40s, I would say. I'm 52 now. So in my 40s, I started to suffer from all sorts of existential angst. And I started to think, what's life about? And what does my success actually added up to? And then I had lots of failures as well. And I was thinking, how do I deal with failure? And how do I bounce back from setbacks? And I started to look at these great investors and think, actually, there are tremendous clues from them about how to deal with uncertainty, how to deal with the fact that we don't know what the future holds. And yet we have to make decisions wisely about the future, whether it's where to invest or where to live or who to marry. Are there clever ways to stack the odds in our favor so that we're less stupid, so that we make fewer mistakes? Are there ways to look at the world where you subtly tilt the odds in your favor so that you make better decisions? And so my interest in the great investors deepened, and I started to think of them not just as money men, but actually as practical philosophers. And that was a big shift. And I think they're also, what I came to realize is they're very fundamentally different, say, from journalists like me or pundits on CNBC or the BBC or whatever it might be, or academics with tenure at great universities, because they actually have skin in the game. And I think in the same way that Dr. Johnson, the author of the dictionary, said the prospect of hanging concentrates the mind admirably, I think the prospect of losing money concentrates the mind admirably. And so these great investors were forced to become very good thinkers. And so they become a really interesting filter to see the world. And so what I did in the Great Minds of Investing, which is a book that I wrote about 5 years ago, that was a book full of portraits, literally photographs of great investors, is I started to write profiles of some of the great investors, but these were short. And then I saw that some of those people I was interviewing were really quite remarkable. And I thought, let me write another book, this book, Richer, Wiser, Happier, where I really go deep on some of the issues that have come up. And so, for example, someone like Howard Marks, who oversees something like $140 billion at Oaktree and is one of the great multi-billionaire investors of our time, I looked at him and I thought, well, he's dealing with these issues like the fact that everything changes all of the time and we can't know the future. The future's unknowable. And he's thought really deeply about how to handle that uncertainty, that unknowable future. And so I thought, let me go deep on that. I'll spend a lot of time with people like him who are really remarkable. And I'll see if I can synthesize and distill these ideas that will help me in life, but will also help lots of readers in life, not just to invest, but actually to think better and possibly even to live better. Because ultimately, I think that's what we're all after. We're all trying to think, how do we actually build an abundant, successful, and happy life? And what truly constitutes a happy and successful and abundant life? And so that became the grand ambition of this book. And that's what I'm still obsessed with. I still want to make money without working too hard and without having to report to anyone who gives me grief. That fantasy is still alive and kicking, but I'm also trying to figure out how to live well and how to think better and how to be wiser and how to be kinder and how to be a better person. And if along the way I can learn that from great investors and I can share it with folks like you, Ashish, and you're a great audience here, that's all the more thrilling for me.
That's wonderful, William. So, to dig deeper into the conversation, I mean, the first section, your book is about richer, wiser, happier, right? So first, let's talk about getting rich. Now, there is somebody in your book, who's basically gotten rich by cloning a master, right? And as simple as it may sound, not too many people do it in a very disciplined manner, right? And he's none other than Monish Pabrai. And some of the insights that you mentioned in his chapter are pretty simple, but really deep. I mean, the simple concept where he said, okay, he made $1 million, right? And then he said, to make this million into a billion, how many doublings do I need, right? The power of compounding, or the concept of compounding. It's so simple, but it's very difficult to fathom. And the second concept where he said that if somebody has done it for a very long period of time, why not just clone him? And he cloned none other than the great Buffett, right? Who had very, very simple rules: buy businesses that you understand within your circle of competence, treat your equity purchases like you're an owner. And but it's so simple to read, understand, but very, very difficult to implement. So, I mean, can you tell us a little more about Monish Pabrai, and how did he manage to clone the greatest investor and still create such wealth?
Sure. One of the very first things that I did when I decided to write this book is I decided, okay, who am I going to go big on? Who am I going to really spend a lot of time with? And the very first trip that I made, which is, I'm embarrassed to say, 5 years ago, because this book took me a long time because it was a bit of a monumental undertaking. The very first trip that I took was with Monish, and we spent 5 days together in India, starting on Christmas Day with this wonderfully memorable drive. It's just I don't need to tell you, but for a foreigner to come to India is always enchanting. The colors, the brightness, the intensity, everything feels like it's in Technicolor. And what I did with Monish, I wanted to understand how he invested and how he cloned the greatest investors. But I was also fascinated by his philanthropy and by the fact that his charitable foundation, Dakshana, which means gift in Sanskrit, that also was a cloned organization. It was a clone of the Super 30, which was this brilliant approach of basically taking these very high intellect kids from very poor, underprivileged families and giving them training so that they could get into the Indian Institutes of Technology and lifting them out of poverty. And so I thought, well, that's a really wonderful example of cloning as well. And so let me go visit a couple of these schools. So we went, for example, to JNV Silvassa and to a couple of other schools. And so I was trying to figure out, well, here's this whole theme, this whole approach to life that's not just about investing, but that's actually about everything. It's about how we give away money, how we structure our lives to be happy, what habits we adopt. And what Monish figured out is that instead of reinventing the wheel, what you want to do in life is look at people who are smarter and wiser and more experienced than us and systematically ask ourselves, what have they figured out that I haven't yet figured out? And how do I clone that? And this is a really wonderful trick in life. And what's extraordinary is that a lot of these insights, a lot of these practices that we can clone are sitting out there, absolutely accessible to us, and yet we don't take advantage of them. And there was a day when I went to interview Monish, also at his office in where was it, in Irvine, California, and we were sitting at his favorite Korean barbecue place, and he was eating his spicy danger dish that he loves. And I was saying, why is it that people don't clone, given that these obvious ways of winning are already out there in the open? And he said, there's something in human DNA that prevents us from borrowing the best ideas from other people. That he said, we're so obsessed with trying to be original that we think somehow being derivative is embarrassing, that it makes us look bad. And he said, if other people won't do it, let the Indian guy do it, I'll do it. And so Monish said that his great advantage, in a sense, was not just that he has a huge intellect. I mean, he was told when he was a kid that he has an IQ in the 180s, having always done very badly at school and thought that he wasn't that talented. Suddenly discovers, no, actually, I'm really bright. I'm just not applying myself. But it's not just his intellect. It's the fact that he's able to master his ego enough to say, well, I don't need to reinvent the wheel. I don't need to be that original. Let me figure out how the Super 30 works and then build it on an industrial scale. Let me figure out what Buffett and Munger have figured out about how to invest, and let me borrow those principles. And so one of the things that he did when he started to study investing in about 1994, when he'd already made $1 million as a technology consultant, and he'd set aside this money carefully. And he, as you said, he wanted to turn it into $1 billion. And he figured, well, if I make 26% a year for 30 years, it'll become $1 billion. So how do I do that? So he starts to systematically reverse engineer Buffett and Munger. And he sees that the rules of investing are really not that complicated, and that they had been laid out very clearly by Buffett and Munger. And so, and they'd been inherited really by Buffett from Ben Graham, who is really the master, the dean of value investing, and the intellectual force behind value investing. And so, as Monish explained it to me, what you need to understand about investing is that when you buy a company, when you invest in a company, you're investing in an ongoing concern. It's a real business. It's not just a speculation. It's not just something where you're buying a piece of paper and trading it. You have no idea even what the ticker symbol stands for. What you're buying is a stake in this business, and the market may not be valuing that business in an intelligent way. The market, as Ben Graham pointed out, is bipolar. And so sometimes it is overly optimistic about the future of that stock, and sometimes it's overly pessimistic about the future of that stock. And so this creates what Ben Graham famously called a margin of safety, where there's this gap sometimes between the market price of the company and the underlying intrinsic value of the company. And so what you're trying to do is invest at times where that market gap, where that gap between price and value is huge. And this is something that people like Raamdeo Agrawal, Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger, Ben Graham, Joe Greenblatt, Howard Marks, all of the smartest investors have figured out that this is the single most important law of investing. And so most investors are trading frenetically. Monish said, look, they own 200 stocks or 1,000 stocks, and they're trading in and out, and they're trying to time the market. And he said, Monish is very colorful in the way he talks. He said, I could see they were all hosed. None of them knew what they were doing. And he said, when you're playing a game, the first thing you need to do is figure out the rules of the game. And he said, I could see that none of these people had figured out the rules of the game. And so the most basic understanding that people like Munger and Buffett have is that what you're trying to do is wait for these rare moments where the market provides you with what Munger calls a mispriced gamble. And so this is what Monish has done. This is how Monish has approached the market, is he has a relatively concentrated portfolio, not too many positions, of companies that he really understands deeply, that he believes the market has misunderstood. And so, for example, a couple of years ago in 2018, he owned basically, Monish is a little crazy. Monish concentrates much more than most of us should do. It would give me a heart attack if I invested the way Monish invests. But he's very high intellect and very high conviction, so he can do it. But he had most of his money in a couple of stocks in one of his funds. And one of them was Rain Industries. And he owned nothing in the US at all. So out of 3,700 stocks trading in the US, he couldn't find a single stock that was cheap enough for him to invest. And then suddenly COVID happens and the market here in the US collapses. I think it went down about 34% in a matter of 30 days, something like that. It was a very intense drop. And suddenly Monish brings full attention to the US market because he knows there are going to be mispriced gambles. And so he sees that there's this company that operates malls. And the last thing you want to own when everybody is forced to stay at home, nobody can shop, is a mall company. But he says, well, I think this company is not going to go bankrupt. It's well run. The debt is owned by Berkshire Hathaway. Warren Buffett has personally a huge stake in this company. He's not going to want it to go under. And they're going to behave honorably. They're not going to try to sink the company or grab the company because they own the debt. And he said, and in the long run, they're going to be able to redevelop these malls and it's going to become really valuable. So Monish buys 13% of this company. And he said to me, well, I think over 10 years, I'll make 10 times my money. And so that's a perfect example of this hyper rational approach to investing, where you're just waiting for these rare opportunities. And this is one of the great approaches to the investing game. There are many different approaches that work with this investing game. But I think for me, that approach that Monish figured out gets at the heart of the rules of the game, of not trying to bet the whole time, not assuming that there are always good bets to be made, but just waiting patiently for opportunity, being prepared to sit on cash when there's no opportunity, being cautious when there's no opportunity, and then understanding that sometimes the market provides you with what Charlie Munger describes as a fat, juicy salmon. And Munger has this beautiful image where he says, you should be like a spear fisherman sitting by the side of the stream. And he said, once in a while, a fat, juicy salmon swims past you and you spear it. And he said, and then you go back to doing nothing, to just waiting. And so what Monish said to me is, the number one rule in investing is extreme patience. And that is both extreme patience in waiting for opportunity and extreme patience in holding your investments. When you find a good investment, you sit. And Howard Marks said the same thing to me. He said, most of the money you make in investing is from sitting and holding and doing nothing. It's not from trading in and out and trying to predict the future and trying to jump in and out of the market and be like a wild man.
Absolutely. William, moving on, the other illustrious investor that you mentioned, and you had a chance to meet him, which was wonderful, is Sir John Templeton, and he's an investor, philosopher, and he's almost an institution, right? For the amount of work his charities have done as well. He had a very different approach. I mean, I think he was the master of value investing, and the famous story is during the war 1939-40, when the markets tanked. He just went out there and picked up all stocks below $1, right? And made a fortune. And I think what I've seen is, after reading your book, most investors, right, they keep repeating that process, right? And they can wait for long periods of time till they get their pitch. So how was it, speaking to Sir John Templeton, and can you give us some insights, how he had such a long, sustainable career? And the other thing which fascinates me is, all of them, I think, somewhere have this trait of being on their own so that they can
Yeah.
think very deeply. And in fact, Sir Templeton almost, he migrated to Bahamas so that he could.
Yeah, yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a very interesting investor, a Canadian named Francois Rochon, who said to me that most of us behave in this very tribal way. That if you look at evolution, we found safety in the herd, and so particularly at intense moments, for example, when the market is crashing, for example, we tend to be followers because we're seeking safety in the herd. But that's actually a terrible approach with investing. And so what Francois Rochon said to me is there's this tiny percentage of people who are non-tribal, who he said lack that tribal gene. They go their own way. And my phrase for this, which I borrowed from someone I interviewed many years ago, is the willingness to be lonely, which I think is a very beautiful phrase. And Templeton embodied this. And there was this wonderful scene once when I was in the Bahamas. I was walking on the beach in the Bahamas. It's a gorgeous place. And I see this little old man, about 86 years old, in the water. And he's pumping his arms like this. And he's wearing this ridiculous hat with this visor here and with ear flaps. And his face is just covered in dollops of sun cream. And he's wearing a shirt. And he just looks like a total idiot. And as I look at this guy, I realize, wait, that's Templeton. And so I don't want him to catch me staring at him. So I'm sort of hiding behind a palm tree, watching him. And when I got back to New York, I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, that's actually a really interesting metaphor for this kind of non-tribal gene. He doesn't give a damn what anyone thinks about how he exercises. He's found, or how he looks. He's found this beautiful spot in the ocean, in the Bahamas, where he can pump his arms and legs against the water in a really effective way. And he doesn't care whether you think he looks like an idiot. He would do this 45 minutes every day. And that came to be a really interesting metaphor for me for how the greatest investors invest. They're not crowd followers. They're not herd followers. And I think one of the takeaways for the rest of us is to say, well, how am I wired? Do I panic when the market is plunging? Do I charge into fads, into the hottest part of the market when the market is surging? Or am I able to think independently and act independently? And one of the things that Rochon said to me, Rochon collects contemporary art. He really uses the fact that he's a money manager to fund his art collection. And he said, I think there are a lot of artists and writers who also lack this tribal gene. They also go their own way. And I think that's one reason why I'm so fascinated by the great investors, is that I actually lack the tribal gene. I just been profoundly independent. I don't really want to work for anyone or take orders. I want to think for myself. And so I think just knowing that about yourself, this isn't either a good thing or a bad thing. It just is. And so I think self-delusion and self-awareness, when it comes to investing, these are really important. You need to look at yourself and say, well, am I wired to be rational, unemotional, to analyze the data? If you are, it's a tremendous advantage. If you're not, it's really helpful actually just to outsource the investing to someone who has a better temperament, or to say, well, let me just index a portion of my funds. Let me have a portion of my funds in index funds. Maybe then I can also find a good money manager who has a better temperament than I have. And so I personally, what I do is I'm by no means a great investor, but this is me trying to solve the puzzle after studying all of these people. I own a couple of index funds that I've owned for many, many years, for more than 20 years. Because I think of someone like Howard Marks saying to me, most people should index most of their money, because I know how difficult it is to beat the market. So for example, with my wife's money or my kids' money, I tend to index it because I don't think they should pay for my overconfidence and delusion that I can beat the market in case I'm wrong. But then I own 3 funds that are actively managed, where people are trying to do what Monish and Templeton are doing. They're trying to be contrarian. They're trying to take advantage of these mispriced bets. They're investing at times when the market is disrupted, and they take advantage of opportunity, and they're very long term, and their expenses are low, and their interests are aligned with mine. So I think they're honorable people. And then I own Berkshire Hathaway stock because I believe in Buffett and Munger and their approach, and it's conservative and I think resilient. And then I took great pleasure in cloning the cloner. So I did clone Monish's bet on this on this mall stock during COVID. But a lot of this is influenced actually by Templeton, because Templeton said to me that if you're a regular investor, if you're not a master investor like him, then he said you should probably own 4 or 5 funds that expose you to different areas of the market. And he said you shouldn't be arrogant enough to believe that you can pick the one great money manager, or the one great fund, or the one great stock, or the one great country or asset class. So he said you need to hedge against your own overconfidence and your own capacity to be wrong. And so every time I'm thinking of making an investment, I come back to this kind of golden rule of thinking, well, am I overconfident? Am I betting too much on one thing? Am I observing what Templeton said about owning 4 or 5 funds? And so it's been a guide to me really for the last 20 years since I interviewed him, to think, well, I need to be somewhat diversified, not so diversified that I've basically just created a closet index fund with high expenses. If I just own lots of funds, then I'm just going to pay very high expenses, and I'll just track the market anyway. So there's this tension between concentration, like Monish, where you own just a handful of things, which enables you to outperform, and diversification, which enables you to survive. But I think that's something that all of us are dealing with. How diversified should we be? And how concentrated should we be so we outperform? And for me, the goal really is something that it's a phrase that I stole from Matthew McLennan, who's one of the great investors I write about. The goal for me is resilient wealth creation. So yeah, I'd like to outperform and I'd like to do fantastically. And I wish I could make 26% a year, but it's not going to happen because I'm not wired that way. I'm not that smart. I'm not that hardworking. I don't have the same temperament as these people. But I feel that if I can compound at a relatively decent rate over the long term without making really disastrous mistakes and just staying in the game, I'll do great. And that, I think, is a much more reasonable goal for most of us. And so I would encourage our listeners who are here really to think about that idea of resilient wealth creation. What does it mean to be resilient? How do you stay in the game? And it really struck me that even though I interviewed all of these great investors who are great market beaters, they're all obsessed with avoiding catastrophe, with staying in the game, with just not getting blown out of the game. And so you always want to be thinking about, well, if I'm wrong, what's the consequence? As Jeffrey Gundlach, who's a billionaire known as the King of Bonds, said to me, he said, the first question I'm asking myself is, if I'm wrong, what's the consequence? Because he said, you need to make sure that your errors are non-fatal. And so there's this really simple idea that I got from Templeton of, let me just not be so arrogant that I think I can pick the one thing. Let me just diversify in case I'm wrong. That's been hugely helpful to me. And I would encourage all of you to think about that, about what's the consequence if you're wrong? How do you protect yourself against your own fallibility, your own overconfidence? your own tendency to get carried away when things are good and become complacent, and your own tendency to panic and become frightened when things are bad. Because really what you want to do is set yourself up counter-cyclically, so that at the moments when things get bad and other people are panicking, you're the non-tribal investor who's going in and saying, yeah, wow, this is great. There are some amazing opportunities now. And Monish said to me during the financial crisis, he said, man, it was orgasmic. He said, the stocks were so cheap, it was orgasmic. And this is a guy who at that time was 67% down during the financial crisis. And he said, no, my wife couldn't even tell that I was, that there was a problem. He said, I was totally happy. And so this is a very strange temperament that the best investors have, right? That they can handle that volatility and just calmly make dispassionate bets on whatever's cheapest.
No, absolutely. I think one of the common threads that you write throughout the book when you're interviewing all these great investors is basically, following a set of rules that are embedded internally in your mind. Second is extreme patience. I mean, I read in your book that a lot of investors wait for very long periods of time, and they can tolerate or withstand huge periods of underperformance, right? To eventually get that outperformance that they desire. So one of the things that keeps bothering a lot of investors or clients is, you invest in a few money managers, and those money managers tend to, let's say, underperform the index, even though they have great long-term track records. How long is long term, and how patient should you be with a money manager? In fact, I remember one of the fund managers you mentioned was the guy in Societe Generale
Mm.
who didn't invest in dot-com stocks because he felt it was a mania and it was a frenzy. He eventually proved to be right, but he risked his entire career uh, on,
Yeah.
on
Yeah,
not
it's a very
investing.
good point. It's a very good point, Ashish. This is Jean-Marie Eveillard, who you're referring to, and he was an extraordinary investor who had a great long-term record. He had a great temperament. He was super rational, and he had a great sense of being a custodian of his shareholders' money. He was managing money for about 1 million people, and he said, "This is their life savings. This is their money for their kids' education. It's their money for their retirement. I can't take wild risk. I need to be prudent." And so during the tech bubble, the dot-com bubble in the late 1990s, which I remember very vividly because I was a young journalist then covering this for Money and Forbes and magazines like that, there were crazy companies that would go public and they'd go up 600% in a day. And so everyone suddenly felt, it was a little bit like today, to be honest. Everybody suddenly felt that investing was easy, whereas actually really what it was wild speculation. And here's this guy quietly saying, no, 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 I'm going to resist these stupid speculative things. I'm not going to buy dot-com stocks that these companies didn't even have revenues, let alone earnings in many cases. They were just crazy speculative excess. And he said that as a result, he underperformed massively for 3 years. And he said what he learned, he had this wonderful phrase, and he had this rich French accent. He said, "To lag is to suffer." And he said, in the first year when you underperform, your shareholders are upset. And he said, in the second year of underperformance, your shareholders are furious. And he said, in the third year of underperformance, they're gone. And that was what he found, that his assets under management sank from $6 billion to about $2 billion. And his bosses basically were saying to him, "You don't get it. What are you doing? Why aren't you getting with the program?" And he said, "You do in truth start to think that you're a fool, that suddenly you're out of touch with reality. And is there a new paradigm that I don't understand? Are these rules about things like being resilient, being conservative, being prudent, are they just outmoded? Should I throw caution to the wind?" And he, to his great credit, couldn't bring himself to do that. But he almost lost his career and his control of the fund by being so stubborn. And this shows you just how difficult it is to be rational, particularly in these very exuberant periods. And I was having dinner with my kids. I have a 20-year-old daughter and a 23-year-old son. And we were having dinner with my wife and the 2 kids last night. And my daughter said to me, "Shouldn't you own Bitcoin, Dad?" And I was like, "That's interesting. Why do you think so?" And she starts saying to me why I should own Bitcoin. And she says, you don't want it to feel like not buying Facebook all those years ago. And I thought that's really a fascinating thing where I said to her, well, maybe that's a symptom of excessive exuberance and irrational exuberance and euphoria that my 20-year-old daughter, who doesn't give a damn about the stock market, is suggesting to me that I invest in Bitcoin. And it's really hard to tell. Is it because Bitcoin is a wonderful new thing, or is it because we live in a time of euphoria and people are throwing caution to the wind and betting on things that they don't understand and just speculating? And I think that's what makes investing so exquisitely interesting and fascinating, endlessly fascinating, is the fact that really smart people disagree about whether something like Bitcoin is a fad or whether it's the real deal, or whether, and this happened many years ago with things like Amazon, where people couldn't really tell. The smart people disagreed. And so this ability to keep your wits about you, to remain prudent when other people are losing their prudence, is key, I think. But it's very difficult. And there are certain things that I ended up referring to a phrase of Warren Buffett's, where Buffett literally has a thing on his desk, a pile that's labeled too hard. And I said to her, I don't know about Bitcoin, so it goes on my too hard pile. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm pretty sure that mall company is going to do well over the next 10 years. And I'm pretty sure that Berkshire Hathaway, which is sitting on $140 billion in cash, is going to survive if the market melts down, and is going to make some intelligent bets and has certain structural things in its favor. Is it going to do as well as Bitcoin? I don't know, probably not. But I just don't know. But I feel more secure. And so for me, the notion of just saying, well, let me keep focused on resilient wealth creation, which means I need to not overreach. I need to not invest in things that I don't understand. I need to try to invest according to a set of rules that are pretty timeless, like buying things at a discount to what they're worth and then holding them. That seems to me logical, and this much I know. And will I be wrong over long periods? Yeah, there'll be periods where I'm wrong for a long time. But one of the funds that I invest in is you were referring to before, run by my friend Guy Spear, who I helped write his book, The Education of a Value Investor. And he runs this fund, Aquamarine, which has this kind of prudent long-term approach to value investing. I've invested in that fund for 20-something years so far. And I've said to him, this is a 40-year investment. And so for me, I'm just trying to tilt the odds in my favor by being more and more patient. And we'll see if it works. Over time, what's worked better for me has been being patient and not overreaching. And the times when I've become impatient and I've rolled the dice on something I didn't understand, I've always regretted it. It's when I was greedy and in a hurry that I got in trouble.
Based on your interactions with so many money managers, and most of them have done extraordinarily well for themselves and their investors, how patient will you be with a money manager who's underperforming? How long is long term for you?
I have, because I'm not very technologically deft, I wouldn't know how to do Excel and stuff like this. I have a sheet that literally just has, a list of my investments, and I update it every few weeks or whatever. And at the top, it says resilient wealth creation. And somewhere after this list, it has a rule, and it says, I cannot sell anything for 5 years. And so I'm basically forcing myself to say, so every time I look at this mall company, or every time I look at one of the funds, and I think, I don't know, is this not good? What am I doing something wrong? Should I get out of my index funds because the index is so high? I just think, no, I'm not allowed to sell anything for the next 5 years. And so I go back to doing nothing. And so for me, I'm aware that the more decisions I make, the more opportunity I have to be stupid. And so I'm trying to make fewer decisions. And so I fundamentally feel that I found fund managers who are honest and who have a process that makes sense. They have principles that make sense, that I understand, that have worked over the long term. They're aligned with me and their interests. They have fee structures that are not exorbitant. They have a lot of their own money in their funds. And I sort of feel like if our interests are aligned and they're honorable, which you can sort of tell from the fee structure, and they have a process that makes sense, I don't really need to jump in and out. Let's say Guy Spear is wrong for a few years, which he's been plenty of times over these 20 years, have plenty of periods of long underperformance. Let's say he's wrong for a few years. But I also think over the long term, he'll reach the destination that I want to reach. I don't need to beat the market by a mile. He's beaten the market by something like 250 percentage points over the last 22 years, despite having many bad years along the way. And so I'm happy to plug away and just stay in there for a long time. So I think the first thing you have to ask yourself is, does this process, does the strategy make sense? Is it built on principles that are enduringly smart, or am I just chasing into the hottest area of the market like some heat-seeking missile? I think if you're charging into a fund because it's in the hottest niche, and it's just had the best returns, you're just setting yourself up for disaster. So I would prefer to be buying a fund that's been underperforming, but that's managed by someone really smart with a really good process, because then I can say, well, there's going to be a reversion to the mean and they'll end up doing well. So I would avoid the one that's been doing really well personally.
That's very interesting and counterintuitive. Buy into a great money manager who's going through a period of underperformance. Very, 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 very simply put, but very tough to do.
Very
I,
hard.
I mean, there is a lot of interesting managers you've covered, which I would want to discuss. But let me also take some questions from the audience, and this is an interesting one. So, during your interactions with so many money managers, these are all great guys, but I'm sure even these guys make mistakes,
Mm.
right? And this reminds me of Munger, who says invert, always invert, and see how you can blow up your fund or how you can blow up your life, and just don't do those things. So why, during your interactions, what are the key mistakes that some of these managers have made and said that this is something which is detrimental to my investing process or life?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time with Bill Miller over the years. I've interviewed him somewhere between 80 and 100 hours over the years, over the last 20 years, starting with a profile that I wrote of him for Fortune many years ago, 20 something years ago. And he's one of the cleverest investors you'll ever meet. Absolutely extraordinary mind, thrilling mind. And he famously beat the market for 15 years running when he was running the Legg Mason Value Trust, which is it's an impossible feat. It's defying gravity, basically. And then during the financial crisis, the global financial crisis during 2008, 2009, he made this catastrophic mistake where he basically decided that all of these companies that were melting down, they would be rescued when the Fed came in and propped them up. And in some ways, it was very similar to the bet that Templeton had made during World War II, where in some ways it was survival of the unfittest, that the companies that had done worst would bounce back really sharply because they'd gone through this kind of near-death experience, and then suddenly they would revive. And so all of these companies like Merrill Lynch and Countrywide Financial, that were Bear Stearns, that were melting down, Miller kept loading up on more of these companies as they were melting down. And for once in his career, instead of this contrarian approach turning out to be brilliant, it turned out to be catastrophic. And he lost something like 65% in his smaller fund and about 55% in his larger fund. And as had happened with Jean-Marie Eveillard, all of the investors flooded out. And so he went from having $77 billion under management, having 800 million under management. And that was a really fascinating mistake to discuss with Miller. And one of the things, and Miller's remarkable and very honest, and I'm a huge admirer of his. And he's bounced back to an extraordinary degree. And actually, I mean, we can talk about this more, but I think has totally redeemed himself and vindicated himself as one of the greatest investors of our generation. But when I talked to him about the lessons of his mistake during the financial crisis, it was to some degree overconfident. He said that at a certain point, when you've been right right for so many years, you start to believe that you're omnipotent. So even though theoretically you know that we're all vulnerable to mistakes and overconfidence, he said he started to believe in his own hype. And so he took a little too much risk and he became too concentrated and too confident. And so he said one of the simple lessons that he's learned is actually just to diversify a little more. So now he probably owns about 45 stocks, that sort of thing, because he said, I wasn't really aware of that I could be so catastrophically wrong. I was aware that I could be wrong, but not so catastrophically wrong. And so I think that simple lesson that if someone as brilliant as Miller can be wrong, all of us are very vulnerable to overconfidence and to analytical mistakes. And so this idea of having to hedge against your own fallibility is really profound. Just to know what I know Qais very well. He's one of my closest friends. I've been invested in his fund for 20 years. And I still think, what if he screwed up massively? What if he turned out not to be an honorable person, even though I regard him as one of the most honorable people alive? What if I'm wrong? And so why would I have all of my money with him? And so just to say, I know that I'm blind, I know that I'm vulnerable to mistakes, is a really powerful lesson. And so to some degree, it's about not overreaching, about not forgetting our vulnerability. And then another great lesson that I learned from Miller making this big mistake is the importance of setting yourself up so that you're emotionally resilient in life. Because we all make these colossal errors in life. We all have things go wrong. We have family medical emergencies. We lose jobs. We get depressed. We have divorces. There are all of these. We're all vulnerable to these difficulties in life. And so one of the reasons that I wrote about Miller at length is I feel like he dealt with this setback in his life, this public shaming that he went through. He dealt with it with extraordinary courage and grace and good humor and honesty. And I wanted to be able to explain to readers, here's how you build a life that's not only financially anti-fragile, but emotionally anti-fragile, so that you can survive these very difficult periods. And for me, this was really important because I've gone through periods where I've failed and I've made big mistakes. And so the ability to bounce back from difficulty and from setbacks is hugely important. And so to me, that's one of the greatest lessons of Miller's mistake. And I write a lot about how he drew on Stoic philosophy to get him through that period. And one of the great essential truths of Stoic philosophy that he drew on is that we can't necessarily control our external circumstances. We don't control what mutations and variants there are going to be with COVID. We don't know, we don't control the speed of a government rollout of a vaccine program. We don't know whether the market's going to surge. We don't know whether we're going to get sick. But there are things that are within our control. And what the Stoics figured out is you want to focus on the things that are within your control. And so what Bill Miller figured out is, well, I can't control my reputation. I can't control whether people badmouth me and say that I'm stupid. But I can control my own attitude towards difficulty. I can be honest about my mistakes. I can learn from my mistakes. I can control my own behavior in terms of being trying to get back my shareholders' money rather than trying to vindicate my reputation. I can keep applying these rules to investing that I know work. He said, I know that if I continue to buy stocks for less than they're worth, over time, that approach works. And I know that I can pick cheap stocks. So if I keep plugging away, it'll work out. And so for me, that's been a really helpful filter in life to say, when I'm going through difficulty, to say, what can I control here? And what can't I control? And let me focus on what I can control, which is my attitude, my behavior, trying to behave like a decent human being. And also, as Sir John Tempelton said to me investing during World War II, he never he said he never despaired at any point in his life, even when he lost his first wife in a motorcycle accident, leaving him with 3 young children. He said, I never despaired or got depressed. I always had faith that the world kind of gets better in the long run. And so as I write in that chapter about Sir John Templeton, his bet on beaten down stocks during World War II, when the world was really collapsing, what he realized is the fundamental truth that the sun also rises, that things get better. And so I think this attitude to mistakes, to setbacks, to failure, to problems that are unexpected, it's very helpful. And I hope if there's one lesson that people learn from my book, it's that they really go through and they try to figure out, how can I make myself more emotionally resilient, more psychologically resilient, so that I can survive the difficult times and rebound from them.
Right. Very interesting. So in your book, other than these, very, very famous investors who are very well known even in our part of the world, you've covered a lot of, fund managers or investors who are lesser known, but they've done extremely well. I mean, I was really fascinated with, your chapter on Net Sleep and Zakaria. And even Ed Thorpe is now known because of his last book that he published. So
Yeah.
of them were very, very fascinating to read about, especially Net Sleep and Zakaria, because one common theme that I saw in your book was these fund managers come from very diverse backgrounds, and all of them have come from very diverse backgrounds, and they've made it successful. And there are some lot of common traits to learn from them. But just talk us through what it was, about Net Sleep and Zakaria, and then maybe Ed Thorpe, again an interesting character.
Yeah, Nick Sleep and Qais Zakaria are absolutely fascinating, and Zach, as he's called, originally came from Iraq. Nick is an English guy who looks like a movie star, very handsome, very charming, really lovely guy, and he wanted to become a landscape architect, and he got a job working for a landscape architect in Edinburgh. And he found, they just wanted me to design like car parks and dormer windows. And he said it was so depressing. It was so not what he'd expected. And then they fired him. There were layoffs and they fired him. And so he was thinking, well, what do I do? And he wanted to stay in Edinburgh because he and his girlfriend at the time, now his wife, had bought an apartment there. And so he looks around and he tries to figure out, well, what's Edinburgh good at? And he says, well, money management. And so he goes and works at an investment firm and discovers that he's unbelievable as an investor, and that investing for him is really a pursuit of truth. That what you're trying to figure out is how to think about thinking, and how to pursue truth, and how to find business models that are superior and that work. And this just suited him as a deep thinker. And so he and Zach created this very, very eccentric hedge fund called Nomad, where basically they were obsessed with this book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is written by this guy, Robert Pirsig, which was turned down by something like 120 different publishers. It's a very eccentric book that sold something like 5 million copies. And Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is all about the pursuit of quality, which is defined somewhat vaguely, but this became a kind of guiding principle for Nomad and for Nick and Zach. And so they were constantly thinking, well, so what's the quality way to behave here? And Pirsig says, well, whether you're mending a motorcycle or sewing a dress or sharpening a knife, there's a beautiful way to do it that reflects these inner characteristics like serenity, kindness, care, patience. And there's an ugly way to do it, a low quality way to do it. And so this became a really powerful filter for Nick and Zach. And so this sounds like a very highfalutin concept that we should all ignore, except for the fact that they beat the market by something like 804 percentage points over the next 13 years. They just crushed the market. So in writing about Nick and Zach, I'm trying to explain, what did they figure out, both about what to do and, equally important, what not to do? And what can we learn from them? What can we clone from them? And one of the things that was fascinating to me is that they had one filter that they applied a lot, was what has a long shelf life. And so most people are focused on information, for example, that has a very short shelf life. So, for example, many investors will say, is this company going to beat analyst earnings over the next quarter? Is it going to beat the market over the next year? What are the earnings estimates for the next year? And Nick and Zach were systematically setting themselves up to focus on things that had a longer shelf life. So they had a Bloomberg terminal that they literally put on a very low stool without a chair, because they didn't want to be bombarded with short-term news and information the whole time that would be a call to action, that would make them act impetuously. Because what they were doing was systematically focusing on the long-term questions. So to give you an example of a long-term question, they would say, okay, what will make a company like Amazon great in the end? And they've owned Amazon for something like 18 years, I think, since it was around $300 a share. And they would say, well, is it adding tremendous value to its shareholders? Does it keep costs under control? Is it screwing its suppliers? Is it squeezing its suppliers? Is it acting in an honorable way? What's the desirable destination for this business to achieve its eventual greatness? And is it making the inputs that will get it to that desirable destination? And they call this destination analysis. So if you think about how different that is than the way most people are behaving, where we're being bombarded by short-term information. So you read a news story that says the market's about to crash, or the market's surging, or everyone's getting rich off this new cryptocurrency. All of these calls to action that are making you behave impetuously. And here are these two guys who set themselves up to be countercultural. And they physically removed themselves from Wall Street. They had an office above a Chinese herb store on the King's Road in London. And they would just sit around all day, and they would go visit as many companies as they could. They wouldn't even read Wall Street research. They would just, they told brokerage firms, yeah, don't even bother to send it to us, and we won't take your calls. So they were just thinking quietly and patiently. And this to me is a very profound lesson, because it shows us that when everybody else is behaving impetuously and is focused on short-term hits of energy, if you can move yourself systematically towards being longer term, towards being patient, towards focusing on the eventual great destination rather than the short-term hit of energy, it's a huge advantage in life. And this is the case in investing, but it's also the case in every other area of life, that deferred gratification becomes one of the great superpowers. If you can say, no, everybody else is focused on the ephemeral. Everybody else is focused on tweets and Facebook likes and stuff like that. So let me sit and read books. Let me set myself up so that I'm more patient. Let me find habits that over 10, 20 years are likely to lead me to a desirable destination. It's a very powerful attitude. And you can also apply destination analysis, as Nick and Zach call it, in a different way, where you can say, what's a desirable destination in my own life? And you start to think, well, okay, the ultimate destination is going to be my funeral. And how do I want people at my funeral to think about me? Do I want them to think, well, he maximized his income and he traded brilliantly and he got as rich as possible, but he was a bit of a snake? Or do you want to think, well, actually, he was a really decent, kind bloke and he tried to help, and he that to me, that's been a very profound area of thinking for me, just to say, what's the ultimate destination, and are the inputs in my life likely to shift me towards that destination, or are they moving me away from that destination? And I think this to me is one of the beauties of investing, is that it's not separate from how we live. It's the way that you think about the stock market actually has real links to the way you think about other areas of life. If you're in a hurry and you're impatient and you're unethical, it shows up in the way you invest. It also shows up in the way that you treat your family, in the way that you treat your partners in your business, or your bosses or your underlings. And so what Nick Sleep said to me is, in some ways, investing is a kind of metaphysical and almost spiritual pursuit. And I think he was understating it. I think what he really was saying is it is a spiritual pursuit. It's a search for truth, and it involves all of these questions like how to behave honorably, how to behave ethically, what the money will do for you, what it won't do for you, what constitutes a successful and abundant life, and should you behave ethically? Is it naive to behave ethically, or is it actually smart in the long term to behave ethically? And one of the things Nick Sleep said to me is, good behavior has a longer shelf life. And I thought it's really fascinating to see his partnership with Zach, that they actually closed down the fund a few years ago and they returned all the money to their shareholders. And they retired at 45. And they said, well, we're going to spend the second half of our lives giving away all of the money in a long-term way to create maximum benefit for society. Because A, we don't want the money to bend us out of shape and bend our kids out of shape. And B, we want the joy of giving money away. And I see that with Monish Pabrai as well, that the joy of giving money away with Dakshana has been tremendous. And so I think when I look at the greatest investors, they're not just masters of making money. They're thinking about, how do I maximize my odds of a happy and successful life? And when you look at people like Nick Sleep and Zach, you see that the way they treat each other is very decent, very honorable. The way they treated their shareholders, very decent and honorable. Because good behavior has a longer shelf life. And you see with both Monish and with Nick and Zach, their emphasis on philanthropy. You saw it with Sir John Templeton as well. So they're not just saying, okay, the money is to maximize my own wealth so that I can buy a fancier car and a fancier jet and stuff. They're figuring out that one way that you stack the odds in your favor to have a successful life is to share the spoils, is to make sure that you're lifting up other people. And so these are the sort of issues that I'm trying to explore throughout the book, so that I'm not just telling people how you get rich. It's how do you truly get rich? Like, what's a truly abundant life? And so for me, people like Nick Sleep and Zach and Monish and Ed Thorpe, they all give you clues about how to build a successful life, a truly successful life.
I mean, I've just not realized, William, how we crossed an hour. It's been a fascinating conversation. But, if you have a little more time, I we cannot end without Munger. He's been, ultimate philosopher, investor. And, I read your story about how you went to see him. And everybody's kind of waiting on him. And he's a wealth of knowledge, and a lot of what he says has clues on how to make your life happier. I mean, like you rightly said, one is being rich, but if you're a billionaire and you're miserable, then what's the point of the wealth? So tell us a little bit about Munger. I mean, we're all big fans of Munger.
Yeah, Munger is very extraordinary. And I end the chapter about Munger with the scene where I help him off the stage, and I'm kind of holding on to his arm here, and he's this little old doddery guy, then 93 years old, now 97, and as I help him off the stage, I say I'm suddenly overwhelmed with this sense of awe, and I say, today I've been in the presence of greatness. And what I'm trying to convey in that chapter about Munger is that his greatness is not because he's a billionaire. In a sense, the fact that he became a billionaire is it's a side effect of the brilliance of his thinking. But it's not just the fact that he's won this game of investing, it's the manner in which he's won it. And there's a beautiful quote from Warren Buffett. Buffett wrote the foreword to a biography of Munger by a writer named Janet Lowe. And Buffett said in the foreword, he said, in 41 years, I've never once seen Charlie try to take advantage of anybody. He said, I've seen him take more of the blame on countless occasions and less of the credit. And I've seen him knowingly take the worst side of the deal with me multiple times and with other people. And I think that's a really interesting insight, that it's not just the scale of the victory of of Munger and Buffett. It's the manner in which they've won. And there was an extraordinary moment where Munger was talking about an opportunity that he and Buffett had to invest in a snuff company where you would sniff tobacco. And he said, this was the best company we ever saw. He said it was such an unbelievable business. But he said, we knew that it was a killing product. And he said, why on earth would we do that? Why would we invest in a company that we knew was a killing product going in? And so he said, then this other family, the Pritzkers, who are multi-billionaires, who have their names on hospital wings and stuff all over the place. I'm not trying to malign them, but I don't want to conceal this either. They bought the company and they made something like $3 billion. And Munger said, why would we have been better off with that $3 billion? We would have been worse off with that money. And that, to me, is part of the greatness of Munger. It's the fact that they were so focused on how to win in an ethical way. And I think that's part of the secret of Munger and Buffett, is that by behaving in an ethical way, they've drawn extraordinary people into their world. They've attracted a higher quality of CEOs working for Berkshire Hathaway, of partners, of advisors, of friends. And I think there's a deep secret in that there is this way of operating where you can be a snake and you can be unethical and you can have sharp elbows and you can crush everyone on the way up. And I think that works, but I think it creates all sorts of disaster. It creates disaster in society. It creates disaster for the people you work with, creates disaster for your family. It makes you, I think it leaves you feeling not great about who you are unless you deny it totally. And then I think there's this counter example that people like Buffett and Munger provide, where they're very aligned with the interests of their shareholders, for example. It's really striking that, for example, Buffett and Munger, I think, take a salary of $100,000 each to run Berkshire Hathaway, one of the biggest companies in the world. And so they're just trying to make profits with you as the stock goes up because they've built value in the business. They're not trying to make money off you by exploiting you and lying to you. And they're candid when they make a mistake. I remember going to Berkshire Hathaway to the meeting in Omaha one year, and Munger said to 45,000 people in the audience, we failed you by not buying Google. And he said, and we screwed up Walmart too. That was a cinch. And when you think of most people, they're marketing themselves, they're lying, they're spinning. And here you have these two old, brilliant guys, 97 years old and 90 between them, 187 years old between them. And they don't bury their mistakes. They don't lie. They say, yeah, we messed up in this way, and this is what we've learned from it. And I think one of the great lessons from Munger and Buffett is not just how to get rich, but actually how to behave. And that for me has been very helpful. And it's very heartening to me to see that the good behavior of people like Munger, Zach, Nick, Buffett, Ed Thorpe, that it works.
Irving Khan. Khan. You write about Irving Khan.
Yeah. Irving Khan I write about, who lived to the age of 109, and I interviewed him a few months before he died, when he was 108, and was asking him what are the secrets of not just an extraordinarily long life, but a successful life. And the things he talked about, so simple. I mean, it wasn't maximizing his wealth. It was things like having kids, grandkids, great grandkids, building something of value, building a company of value that took care of its shareholders, that invested their money prudently, and that didn't overreach and didn't take crazy risks. And so, and also he talked about just how much he had loved learning, that he was very close to Ben Graham. He was Ben Graham's teaching assistant to Columbia in, I think, 1929, 1930, sometime like that. And he said, there are secrets in life, and sometimes you're confused, and you just need to get the answers from someone who's smarter than you and wiser than you. And it was pretty clear that he had learned from Graham. Graham had given him these secrets. And the first secret for him, when Irving Khan talked about the secrets of investing, he said, you can sum it up in one word. And he said, it's safety. He said, you have to focus first on the downside, on not losing. And he said, if you're relatively smart and you're relatively conservative and you do well over time, you're going to do way better than your speculator friends who are taking wild risks. And so I thought that was really interesting, that looking back on a long life at the age of 108, what really mattered was creating something of value with his business, working with family members, having kids who were healthy, who he loved. These are pretty simple things. And Ed Thorpe said the same thing to me. Ed Thorpe, who's probably the greatest gambler in the history of the world. I mean, just an extraordinary gambler in casinos, with blackjack, with roulette, and then with a hedge fund that didn't have a losing quarter in 20 years. He said, yeah, the single most important thing in your life is probably who you spend your time with. So he said, it's really all about relationships at the end of the day. And so I wanted to make it clear that this isn't just about learning from the greatest investors how to get rich. It's also about how to build a life that's actually truly abundant. And so it's interesting to me that all of these people are focused so much on building relationships that work, on family, on behaving in ways that are honorable. And this is not to say that they're perfect individuals. Like all of us, they screw up, they make mistakes, they do things that they regret. But I think if you can subtly tilt the balance towards this type of behavior, you increase your odds of a happy and successful life. And I think one of the great lessons from Munger that I won't go into at length here, because I think you should read about it, is that also it's hugely powerful just not to be stupid. And so if you just list all of the things that lead to a bad destination and then say, let me not do that, that's really helpful. So I would encourage you to go through the book and look at some of the things that Munger describes as standard stupidities that lead to a bad outcome, both in investing and life, and just say, okay, maybe I'm not as smart as Munger, but at least I can do really well by just not doing these standard stupid things. And that turns out to be an incredibly successful approach to life and to investing.
Absolutely. William, it's been a wonderful and fascinating conversation. I've really enjoyed it. And, I'm sure, all our clients, investors, and the audience who are watching it on YouTube have benefited from this chat. But more importantly, I have read the book, and I can tell you, at least I'm wiser. I hope I can learn to be happier over time by cloning some of the habits of these great legends. Like you said, not just investors, but these guys have really thought very deep and figured out how to build a more complete life, right? And be happier and have a more fulfilling kind of life over time. So if you really want some of these insights, and there's lots more in the book, I can tell you. I mean, there are a lot of managers, for paucity of time we haven't been able to chat about, right? You'll find all of this in this book. It'll definitely, hopefully, make you a better investor. But more than being a better investor, I think it'll also give you some frameworks, some rules on how to make your life richer, happier. So, William, thanks a ton for doing this with us, and all the best with your book. I'm sure it's gonna do extremely well in India, especially after this webinar. There are a lot of people on this webinar who are opinion makers, and I'm sure they're going to spread the word. First, they're going to buy a copy, I'm sure, and read it like I have, and we'll all hopefully be wiser after reading a book. So thank you very much for doing this.
Ashish,
Thank you.
if we can just have one additional minute with Mr. William on his interactions and discussions with Raamdeo ji, because a lot of people have been asking that question. If they can shed a little light on that.
Sure. Can you hear me? Yeah. I had a fascinating interview with Raamdeo Agrawal, and one of the frustrations with this book is that I interviewed so many people. I overdid the reporting to such an extent that at a certain point I just decided, okay, let me write another book, and then I'll be able to go into these subjects in more detail. So there are people that I interviewed who I would spend hours with, a multi-billionaire, and then I be able to write 2 sentences about them. And so Raamdeo Agrawal, this is a good example of something where you have a person who's deeply understood the benefits of cloning, who goes again and again to Omaha each year to figure out what can I learn from these great masters, Buffett and Munger, about what works in investing and about being patient and investing in great businesses. But also, I remember him talking to me about the limits of cloning and of wanting to be true to yourself. And I think this is a very important issue. We want to learn from the best, but we also need to be true to ourselves. We need to apply these laws of investing and these laws of life in ways that work in our circumstances. And I remember him explaining to me, yeah, in some ways it's a totally different environment here in India, and so I have to apply these principles, but also modify them and think about how they work in a different setting. And so to learn more about this, you'll have to read a future book where I'll get to write about it in greater depth. But I think what I like is that you find these great investors around the world who are all basically going back to the same well, to the same source, and saying these ideas are very robust, and there are a lot of different ways to apply these truths. You can have a concentrated portfolio, you can have a diverse portfolio, you can invest in more expensive companies, less expensive companies, but it's all basically the same principle. As Joel Greenblatt says, it's value a business and buy it for less than it's worth. And I think that's at the heart of what Motilal Oswal would be doing. It's at the heart of what Buffett and Munger are doing, part of what Howard Marks is doing. It's about buying assets for less than they're worth, being patient, resisting impetuous, impulsive behavior that gets us to jump in and out of the market, time the market, and do self-destructive things. And if you get those big things right, of being patient, staying in the market, taking advantage of uncertainty and disruption, and the moments when other people panic, over time it's going to work out. And so I feel like you're drinking from the same well as I am with Raamdeo Agrawal. He understands the beauty of these lessons that have come from Ben Graham through Buffett and Munger, and he's applying it in a different context, in a different setting, in a different environment. And so I hope I'll get to write about that in greater depth down the road, and it'll give me an excuse to come spend some more time in India, which is the most wonderful place to be a reporter.
That's good. Thanks a lot. Again, that's been a great session for us. Ashish?
Yeah, so thank you. I think, it's been a great session. Thank you very much, William.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Look forward.
And I wish you all a great weekend.
Thank you. Wish you a great day and a great weekend.
Thank you so much.